Welcome to The State of Us. Real people with honest opinions and the future of responsible media. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Amazon versus Sears employees. What's the real difference? So we're going to look at Sears in the heyday, and Amazon's definitely in its heyday. So we're going to be examining the differences there. If you were an employee at Sears versus an employee at Amazon today, how would life be different? And what does it tell us about where the state of the economy is? And why do you care? Well, it's your money, your life. It's the driving force of where we stand and how well off Americans are today, particularly if you're a millennial or if you're a member of Generation Z and you're just entering the workforce. You probably should care, I would think, about whether or not you're getting a fair deal when all those friendly old people tell you that you're lazy and that, you'd be better off if you worked harder, and that you're making more money than they were. We've talked about this at length as far as minimum wage goes, but we're going to look at it kind of through a different lens today of benefits that companies provide and how it's different. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation that involves any kind of history without
your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Okie doke. Sears on its way out, Amazon on its way up.
Yep.
Okay. But how it affects the worker, huh?
How it affects the workers.
The worker bee, the drone.
Yes.
All right, here we go.
The New York Times reported on this on October 23rd, and they said half a century ago, a typical Sears salesman could walk out of the store at retirement with a nest egg worth well over $1 million in today's dollars, feathered with company stock. A warehouse worker hired now at Amazon who stays until retirement would leave without a fraction of that. This month, Amazon stopped giving stock to hundreds of thousands of employees, even as it lifted its minimum hourly wage to $15, which we talked about. While the raise garnered headlines, like it did with us, the move to curb stock may ultimately be more significant. And we're going to look at exactly why that is. So companies like Procter & Gamble, Hallmark Cards, and Sears, along with U.S. Steel, all embraced profit sharing and were part of a corporate movement to encourage the practice, particularly back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Among some leading executives in the early to mid 20th century, there was a notion that wages were not enough and workers had a right to share in the fruits of their labor. By present-day standards, Amazon is relatively generous. In addition to 401ks, full-time employees receive medical insurance and a week of paid vacation in their first year. 50 years ago, though, Sears provided all of that plus a much larger annual retirement contribution. While the typical Amazon employee receives $680 from the company in a 401k, the average Sears worker got the present-day equivalent of $2,744. Dividends on accumulated stock could add thousands to that annually. So what's our difference there? That's like what do we got? A 8 or 9 time increase there, right?
I'm just sitting here thinking.
Okay.
I'm not doing the math. I was just thinking, wow, from a historical perspective,
yeah,
it's like, and nobody wants unions.
I know you bring back your unions.
Well, what was going on in the 40s and 50s when the worker was being treated well? Most jobs, the unions were much stronger, much larger, and they forced companies who weren't even unionized to do things to get workers. Well, now we live in a generation and an age where unions are bad unions. And look at how the owners are taking advantage of the workers. That's why I've been preaching it for 30 years that everybody's like, we don't need unions. We don't need unions. I'm like, what do you think these rich people are going to do once there's no union or no threat of a union? They're going to go back to the days of Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford, and they're going to keep their own money. Ta-da!
And that's
and
to be
reap
fair,
what you sow.
Right? If any of us were in their position and they didn't have to give more of their money to other people.
Right. But
I mean,
but the article doesn't,
right?
The article doesn't address that. What the article addresses is, well, look at the difference between Sears and Amazon. Well, to me, they're missing a big point. What drove Sears and Procter & Gamble and those places, Hallmark, to do that was either a unionized workforce or the threat of a unionized workforce. So therefore, we have to profit share. And you could also argue the tax laws, because in the 50s, there were, if companies made over a certain percentage of money, they had to pay it in taxes. Corporate tax rates were so much higher. So it's like, well, do I really want to take my hard-earned money and give it to the U.S. government? Well, not really. So I'll give it to my employees instead. And you got bonuses and you got stock options and you got, because the option for the owners was to pay the corporate tax. Well, now we've seen corporate taxes being dropped, historically and everything else. And to the point where now it's like, well, what's the incentive to do something for the worker? Because Amazon goes on in that story, right? And they say, well, we don't need to give them stocks anymore because we just give them $15 an hour. So tit for tat, one took care of the other. Because now the president and Congress just cut the corporate tax rate, so we get to keep more of it. And so we're going to. No, I don't blame them, but that's why I said people for the last 30 years shouldn't have been poo-pooing the unions.
They're doing what anybody else would do, which is understanding how the system's set up and using the system that's in place.
They're doing what the captains of industry did back at the turn of the century, from the 1800s into the 1900s.
The article notes that the Sears approach was not without flaws, though. By putting much of its assets into the company's stock, it made workers even more exposed to their employer's fate. So there is that downside of, obviously, if your employers are more heavily vested in the company, yes, the good times are better, but the bad times are also worse than if you have that steady hourly wage. So it becomes a question, I think, more of, how smart are you going to be with your money when you have it? If you're going to be smart enough to say, well, it's not always, because Sears right now is the perfect picture of that.
Sure.
Sears is not doing well at all. I mean, they just filed for bankruptcy protection. So obviously a company's fortunes can change, and people look at Amazon today, right? And they say, well, that can never happen because all this and that and the other. And, they're capturing the whole industry and all this, right?
But it too shall fall.
But isn't that exactly what Sears was doing back in its heyday? I mean, it was the same thing. Everybody shopped at Sears. Everybody got Sears catalog, and everybody,
You ordered online.
Right. I mean, it was the same
we
version
had delivery back then too.
Yeah.
Just, for you millennials out there, there was such a thing as delivery for JCPenney and Sears. You could order from the catalog, and there was a store where you could go. It was a catalog store in your little town, and you could go pick up your order or have it sent to your home. So what's new is really old.
Yeah. It's just a spin on that same model modernized. I mean, Amazon's website is a catalog. Is it a much more spanning, more easily searchable, more readily accessible catalog? Sure. But it's the same basic principle of, we're providing
I don't know. My mom could pick up the phone after we looked through the 1,000-page Sears catalog and place the order for our school clothes. And it got delivered before we started school. And we never had to go anywhere since our local town didn't have. And we were an RFD, which means we got rule-free delivery. That's what that stands for for you young people.
That's nice.
If you lived way out in the boonies, then the government said it was okay to ship you stuff for free because you didn't have anything within an hour or 2 hours of where you lived to buy this stuff.
That's an interesting subsidized way of living. Yeah. What happened to that?
Well, you're making $15 an hour. And
you don't need it.
And you've got your Amazon and you got your drones. And you got your Ubers and all this kind of stuff you keep telling me. You don't need stuff like that. You guys, it's all there right now for you at your fingertips.
So this is pretty telling. If Amazon's 575,000 total employees, which is kind of hard to fathom. I don't know. Can you imagine that many people?
Yeah, but then the question becomes how many of them are full-time?
Sure. But if the total number of employees at Amazon, so, I mean, we're counting part-time people, right? If they all owned the same proportion of their employer's stock as the Sears workers did in the 1950s, each of them would own shares worth $381,000. So I would definitely say it's a little different. And this speaks to the bigger thing that I've been passionate about in these topics that we're discussing, which is debunking this notion that has been spread. And I don't think it's intentional. I don't think it's one of those, the baby boomers are out to get the young people kind of thing. I think every old generation does it to every young generation in one way or another. They're either immoral, they're corrupt, they're lazy, they're whatever. They're something, they're all those Vietnam hippies running all over the place. They're all weird. They're all nuts. They're young. That's what they are, in one way or another, they're young, and something about them is different than us, and it's weird. But it's this hope of debunking the common perpetrated myth that the reason millennials don't have more money and aren't more successful and own their own home is because they are lazy, as opposed to it's because the jobs they have and the fact that it's just the reality, just the facts, they work more hours than previous generations. The productivity under the millennials in the workforce has increased by more than 30%, and we make significantly less money per hour invested of time. And now we're looking at less in benefits. This is all part of hoping to debunk that it's not really because we're lazy. The world's policies are different, and it means that what we earn is not the same. Now, we may be lazy, but you have to ask yourself, and that's what I told Lance before the show, why? Because there is a reason. It's not, you can't just end it there with, well, they're just lazy because they're lazy, Maybe if we're going to play into your, not you, Lance, but because I know you've been on this side of, you even said, right, in that whole wage show, I had previously kind of been on the train of thinking that was part of the problem.
Sure.
But we look at the numbers, and Lance was able to say, I'm smart enough to know when I look at the numbers and can see that it's just not the same.
Right.
People are not likely to work really hard if they don't feel like they're rewarded for that work. Mm-hmm. Everybody talks about how hardworking the baby boomers are, and I'm not disputing that. But there was a reason. Mm-hmm. They were rewarded.
Yes.
There were pension plans. There were retirement benefits. There were stock options. There were lots of reasons to stay with a company, to be loyal, to put in your time, to work your butt off. It's a lot easier to do that if you come home and there's plenty of money in the house and the 2 cars and, all of a sudden, it's worth it, It's not the capacity to work hard isn't there. It's the motivation to do it is lacking. And again, we're still working more hours because there's not much choice. You're making less money. You have to work more in order to have a chance of having the same amount. And productivity still has increased despite that, which is, again, all the more case. So I don't know. I'm getting off on that point, but I wanted to share it because that's part of why we're continuing this.
Sure.
It's part of that.
It's part of that discussion.
It's part of that discussion. Several employees interviewed who insisted on being anonymous because they were not authorized to speak publicly expressed disappointment. Amazon should have saved the dollar and kept giving workers stock, said one warehouse employee in Baltimore. Amazon insisted that workers were not losing out. Quote, the significant increase in hourly cash wages effective November 1st more than compensates for the phase out of incentive pay and future stock grants, said a company spokeswoman. So there you have both sides of the tale.
Well, it's true too, like you said, all that Sears stock that people had owned for all these years is now worthless because they're going bankrupt. So, if you saved it for a rainy day, it's now not worth anything.
Not doing you much good.
Right. So it does have to do with, though, but what if I did earn it and when the company was making money, I sold it? I know my brother worked for a tech startup and he got paid in stock options. And at 28, he was worth ungodly amount of money. Then the company went bankrupt and he had nothing. And he had to go find a whole new career and a whole new job. So, on paper, he was very wealthy. in his mid 20s, early 30s.
And in reality, not so much.
And now, and then he wasn't, because all that disappeared, because he was getting it in stock options and taking it in stock options. And he thought it was, the new wave and everything else. And I mean, he was making a living wage, but he was worth so much more. Look at, I'm going to retire by the time I'm 40. And then the company went bankrupt. And so all the stock options that he had, I mean, he still owned, how many thousands of shares of this stock, but it wasn't worth anything because the company no longer exists. So you run your risk either way. And, but what this does, and what people, we saw it, the one percenters, the Wall Street movement and all that kind of stuff a few years ago, but it's just making more money for the wealthiest, even less than 1%. It's less than 1%. It's where all the tax cuts went. The rich are getting richer. And the question becomes, okay, this is the fact. We're presenting it in a variety of ways. Minimum wage isn't where it should be as far as earning power compared to where it was 30 or 40 years ago. Now stock options are being taken away. They're doing this, they're doing that, this, that, and the other. So the question becomes now, what are we going to do about it? I mean, I don't think you don't have to be, again, if you're interested in this and you look at the numbers, it slaps you in the face. The question becomes, okay, are we going to live with it this way, or are we going to do something about it? And if we are, what is it that we want? What's the goal that we want? Because going back, I mentioned the captains of industry, Rockefeller, Ford, Carnegie, but they were also known as robber barons at the time. And there was no labor union. There was no income tax. These guys made money. They made money. What was taxed was there were tariffs. I know it's a word out there now where, 150 years ago, when you bought something from overseas, you paid a tax on it. And that's what ran the U.S. government. If you didn't buy anything from overseas, then you didn't pay to support the government. And that's where we started to get the idea, well, how do we take money from the rich and give it to the poor? Well, we have an income tax. And that has developed, and now we have a graduated income tax, meaning there are different tax levels based on how much money you make, but then you also then got all of the loopholes and the deductions and all this other stuff that's been, so it really becomes a tax question in how you want to live. Mm-hmm. But we're going back to, and this is where your resident historian is bringing up this issue that isn't in the article, but we're going back to where we were in the 1880s and the 1890s. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but understand this isn't new. And the question becomes, what do you want? And if you're going to have more in taxes, then you're getting away from capitalism and you're marching towards some kind of socialist economy. Now we know where this ends up, the Great Depression of the 1930s, because at some point this will all come tumbling down.
It'll all come to a head.
And I'm sorry, folks, it just will. Okay. And I'm not saying that because the stock market's been volatile. NASDAQ, the S&P have all been very volatile here in October. But anybody who thought it was going to, everything was going to stay with this kind of growth is crazy. And I'm somebody who's invested, and I'm getting my pension plan is invested. So as the stock market and everything comes crumbling down, it's going to affect this old guy. So I get it. That's why we have the safety nets in place. That's why we have Medicaid and Medicare and pay taxes. But then what we have now is that the wealthy aren't paying taxes. And without them paying the taxes, there's not enough of us earning enough money to pay the government to turn around and take care of us. That's why the deficit's so high.
And before
so it becomes this is a real economic issue. And then what do you believe is the role of the government? Before the Great Depression, it was on you to take care of yourself. And if you were an entrepreneur and you started your own business like Amazon, like Facebook, you got to keep all the money. You only had to pay your workers what you had to pay them in order to keep them. You didn't have to offer them vacation. Heck, people were working 80 hours a week. They were working 7 days a week or 6.5 days. They got Sunday mornings off to go to church, and then they were expected to work half a day Sunday afternoon. They worked 6.5, 7 days a week. Or they work, they got their birthday off. There was no paid vacation. There was no stock plan. And America was bustling and booming and everything else. Then we decided, actually the government decided we don't want the people to overthrow the government, so we're going to create income tax.
We're going to
Social
appease,
Security.
We're going to appease the people.
We're going to appease the people so we can stay in power.
Which should be the government's job anyway, right?
Well, that's
why they're here.
If you get voted on by the people, you have to keep the people happy so they don't overthrow the government.
Yep.
Well, in my opinion, we're reaching that point again, where big business and a few people are controlling most of the money, and they're sitting back and counting their money while the masses are struggling. Now, you and I laugh a lot off air about first world problems, but compared to the way we used to living, the baby boomers versus the millennials, there's a struggle here. Mm-hmm. And people with millennial age children are seeing it because, my kids can't live out on their own.
They're living with me.
Because they can't make enough money. It's not because they're lazy. They're working, but I pick up the paper to try to find them an apartment, and there's nothing for them that they can afford with what they're making. Mm-hmm. So I don't force them out of my home because I can look and there's nothing that they can afford.
Yep. Well, and Lance and I both know somebody who now is living in their quote unquote own house, but it's rented. And you've got 2 other roommates, So even then you haven't achieved what quote unquote the dream is, right? And I'm not saying that we have to all measure it off of can you afford a house, because I think there's other things going on with millennials as to why they don't necessarily, as many of them don't want to purchase a home. But we just looked at that, what was that, 2 weeks ago, where the survey found that when given the choice, it's like 87% of the public, which includes millennials, all, if money wasn't an object, wanted their own house. So it isn't just
but in today's job market,
millennials like moving around.
No, that may not be a good decision.
Right. And that's where that's also some of what accounts for millennials not purchasing homes. But the point is, just as a measuring stick, if you want a house, but your only choice to get a house is 2 other roommates and you rent it, so you're just, again, rent is, whether or not we look at it that way, it's a payment for a service which there is no return on. You're not going to make that money back. You just get something for it. It's just like when you go to the store and you purchase a banana and you eat the banana is not going to provide you that money back. It's just you need it, so you paid for it. The difference with a house is, the thinking goes anyway, that you should someday recoup that investment if you choose to.
But again, that was only made available after World War II,
yes,
when the government enacted laws that made it affordable and a better investment for people to buy their own house. Until World War II, the majority of Americans rented. And there wasn't this concept of the American dream being a homeowner. That was established by the government to stimulate the economy, with the war veterans returning home after World War II, with the VA loan and tax laws that benefited homeowners.
Favorable to incentivize you to go get a home, which built a whole new economy.
The government created that.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't part of the American dream.
Just as the minimum wage and all of that.
The government created that to placate a group of people and to stimulate an economy after the war, because we were still coming home to a messed up economy after World War II.
And a bunch of kids with no marketable skills. I mean, a marketable skill being I can hold a gun and shoot the enemy.
And if we make it,
doesn't do a lot of good for you once you're back.
If we incentivize homeowning, then that creates jobs, because people have to build these homes.
Yep. Which we can teach people to do.
Right.
Because they were taught how to work hard. So we can put them to physical labor work.
And then they're going to make money. Then they're going to want to buy a home. And then you have to buy furniture. You have to buy paint. You have to buy
Sears.
carpet, and you go and you get all this. And so now it's an economic multiplier in that the economy grows and grows and grows because of the stimulus of making it part of the dream, in air quotes, to own a home. But that was all done by the government to stimulate the economy so the people didn't come back after the war and overthrow the government because they went and risked their lives, and many of them lost their lives, to come back and starve to death at home because they couldn't get work. And again, you can argue with me if you want, and I will show you the laws and the history of how this all has taken place. So again, the government, whether you like it or not, is in control. And everybody says, well, I don't want the government to be in control. Okay. Then you go back to the 1800s, to the 19th century, when people were dying because they couldn't afford medical care. They couldn't afford to buy anything because they had no money, and their crops failed, and their neighbors' crops failed, and the whole community would die out. I'm okay with that if that's what you know you're going to get into, but you can't have your feet in both worlds. And that's what this means to me, more than bashing on Amazon. I'm bashing on Amazon because I think that's wrong for people. But if that's what you want, just understand what the other side of that is. Is that, I mean, how many generations of families lived together in the United States before the Great Depression, before World War II? Grandma or somebody owned a home, and mom and dad and the kids, and you had 3 generations or 4 generations living in the same house or living in the same apartment. This isn't new. I'm getting frustrated. This isn't new, folks. We've been here before, you know?
And that's the point of it.
I'm not a big believer in the saying that history repeats itself, but in this case, it does. This is what it was like 80 years ago in America, before the Great Depression and before World War II. And I'm not saying I'm not saying those things are going to happen. I'm just saying the economy is the same, and what people are having to do is the same. And the way we fixed it were government intervention, government laws, like tax laws, like incentives to buy homes, like a minimum wage, the growth of labor unions, all to fight the wealthy and to try to spread the wealth out to the masses so that people could take care of one another and take care of themselves. Mm-hmm. It's up to you as to which way you want to go, but understand the wealthy company owners aren't going to take care of the masses on their own. They never have in history.
Right. Well,
they never have.
The nature of people in an organized society is to figure out how to think about when you play a board game, right? If you're told the rules, the object of the game is to figure out how, within the rules, you can win the game. And that's what these people are doing. You know, the rules are such, all they're doing is playing the game to the max. You know, Jeff Bezos is not an evil man. He's playing the game to win, you know, because those are the rules of the game. And so, and yeah, you can get into the whole, well, they're bending the rules. Yes, sure. But that's what you do. You know, when you sit down to play a board game, as long as the rules are situated in such a way that you can figure out how to exploit the rules for your advantage, that's what you do. And unless the rules are changed to make it harder to do that, you're going to keep doing it.
Well, you change the rules and say, all right, anything over $1 billion, 80% of it goes to the government in taxes. Okay, there's your incentive. Mm-hmm. You make more than $1 billion, everything you make more than $1 billion, 80% or 90% of that goes to the U.S. government in taxes.
And people,
that's what the law used to be.
That's exactly what I was getting
That's not like, oh my God, we could never do that. No, that was the 1950s in the United States. So when Sears and Procter
was 90%.
Right. And so what companies did is they gave Christmas bonuses. They gave birthday bonuses. They gave people health care. You know, they because I would rather spend the money on my company than give it to the government. And the beneficiary of that was the American worker. So it was the government's laws that caused business people to take care of the workers. So when you start talking about, and please don't shoot me for using it, make America great again, and you want to go back, which you can't do in history, but you want to go back to the time when workers had enough money to live on and they could buy their house and they could send their kids to school and all that kind of stuff, then you have to increase the tax rate on the wealthy.
Mm-hmm. And corporations.
Okay. So nobody's telling you that. And if you go back and you check it out, you can Google tax rates. You can Google corporate tax rates. You can go back and see it by year by year. You can see it by decade. That's what, quote, the America that I think a lot of people want to go back to. And it was when the corporate tax rate was so high that it forced companies to spend money on their employees, which is what everybody remembers as, quote, the good times.
Mm-hmm. We're literally,
along with labor unions and all of those other things, because the government was afraid that they were going to lose the people.
And corporate tax was, basically 4 times what it is now. And keeping in mind, let's pull back even to the bigger picture, Lance, if we're talking about, because there's this argument that happens when we talk about this, right? Is if the tax rate is so high, we'll leave everybody to think about this, then it stifles innovation in companies. But remember the economy we live in. As Lance highlighted, we've been here before. We'll be there again. That's how capitalism, in its most honest sense, works. The people, right, get exploited until they don't take it any longer, and then they push the other way. Innovation slows down, then business pushes back, innovation roars back up, people get pushed back down, people stand back up, and so on and so forth. And that's how it works. That's the, people talk about the great engine of the American economy and our innovation and all this. And that's because that's how it has worked in the past, is we go through these cycles of 80 or 100 year spurts of, we get really innovative for a while and we really loosen the reins on business and, they're revving away. And then the workers start to realize, well, the companies are doing great, but we aren't. And slowly it builds. And then bam, they push back and they say, no, we demand it all. We want all the benefits. We want houses. We want 2 cars. We want more money. And the companies say, oh, gee, well, we really don't have any choice, because if they all walk out on us, then we're just we can't make any money.
We don't make any money.
Right. So, and that's the point, I guess, of the people who worry about innovation. And I'm one of those, I own a business, right? TrueChat. We're right here, right now. I don't like that idea. In a short-term perspective, no business owner is going to like the idea of raise the corporate tax rate. But you have to keep in mind what goes around comes around. It's not so much go back as it is go forward on the path that our country is set up on, which is this ebb and flow of innovation coupled with moving people forward. People will be pushed until they won't. And then the people push back and the companies give in, and then and so on. I guess that's the point I'm trying to get at, is people get so upset about, on both sides, this, that, or the other. And it's like, as Lance had said, it's all happened already, just with a different backdrop, with different motivation. It's happening again. The tech companies roared away, and then the bubble burst and the economy corrected and it said, no. And the banks spent too much, right? And they gave loans to people who shouldn't have loans. And then guess what? The economy corrected it again. That's what happened in 2008. It said no. The economy said, no, you can't do that forever. It doesn't work that way.
You can't have unparalleled growth forever.
Right. You can't.
And if the stimulus is then to give corporations more money, all they're going to do is keep it.
Yes.
As you said, that's human nature.
Right.
They're not going to reinvest it in the economy because that's not the way it works.
Yeah.
It's never worked that way.
When's the last time?
To think to give rich people more money is going to stimulate the economy and the trickle down effect. Never in history has it worked.
When did you last sit down to play a board game, or for millennials, a video game, and in the board game scenario, let's say, you won a get out of jail free card, and you just turned around and handed that to another person, one of the other players, because you just said, well, I'm doing really well and I feel bad for you. So here's this get out of jail free card. No, you didn't. You didn't do that. I'm sure there are some people who have, but most of us wouldn't do that. Same thing if you're in the video game. When's the last time you stood out in the middle of the battlefield because you were winning, right? And said, well, I'm just going to stand here and let some people shoot me and get some points because I'm winning and I think everybody else should be closer to me.
Hey, you're on your last life. I've got 100 lives. I'll give you 10 more lives.
Right.
Because I only have 90.
Yeah. And people say, well, that's just a video game, but it is a game, it is a game. And the people are going to keep winning the game until you tell them they can't anymore.
Well, there was a board game called Life.
Yeah.
So you could argue that life is a game. It is a game. And as long as and people will take advantage of the rules. They'll play the game.
As long as you let them.
They'll play the game by the rules, but they will learn how to play it better than other people.
Yep. I think that's where we miss the boat on this, is we all get worked up over the corruption, and it's not that, to me, is missing it. There's always going to be the corruption. Lance and I have talked about that so many times. People will always figure out how to break the rules, but most people follow most of the rules most of the time. So it becomes about what most of us do, not what the few bad people who try to do the bad things do, By most measures, Amazon follows the rules, So if you don't like it, then we change the rules. And you would think, now that we've done this cycle a couple times in our very short history as a country relative to other countries, that we would get better about saying, the predictors are here, it's coming. So instead of letting it get so bad like we have in the past, let's smooth that transition. And then again, the next time it's headed in the wrong, smooth the transition instead of it having to be what it was for the Great Depression. Instead of it having to be that kind of a correction, we can be easier with it. You would think.
And again, go back to 2008. Look what happened. The President Bush and President Obama stepped in. The government stepped in and corrected the economy. That's the only reason it didn't get as bad as the Great Depression. Because in the Great Depression, the government said, no, we're staying out of it. We're going to let it correct itself.
And it will.
And it will. But how many people are going to suffer? Okay.
Yeah.
And because we've learned our lesson, the government people can say, wow, they shouldn't have bailed out the banks. They were rich. And blah, blah. You're right. But we would probably still be coming out of that instead of the growth that we've had in the last 5 or 6 years. Just saying, folks, just telling you, I think I'm trying to tell you like it is.
Yeah. People have to keep in mind the kind of implications that allowing a bank like JP Morgan and Chase to fail has. Because the government doesn't just have that kind of money sitting around, the federally insured banks. It leads to a chain reaction of failures. It isn't because, again, the whole crash was banks bought other banks' bad loans that they shouldn't have made in the first place. And it was 2 or 3 deep. So it's dominoes. One falls and they all come down.
And if the government doesn't step in, then your business that you work for shuts down and you're out of a job.
Right. And
I mean, that's where it matters to you. Because I know that's a big part of this show. Why does this all matter to you? It sounds like we're talking about the wealthy. But what it all happens is when it all falls, the dominoes fall on you. The people who are at the bottom get hit the hardest.
They always do.
And that's why you should care about this. That's why you should be paying attention and figuring all this out. And I'm not trying to say doom and gloom, but understand what fiscal policies really would be best for you. Don't buy that pipe dream of the American dream that if we just have unregulated capitalism, it's good for the common man. It's not.
Right.
Now, doesn't mean that we can't have it, because I've told you many a times in the last 7 or 8 years, I'll find a way to win and I'll take care of myself.
Mm-hmm.
But not everybody's going to be able to do that.
Yeah. It's just it's the rules of capitalism. As long as you live in this kind of economy, we can't all win all the time. Either the rich lose or the people lose, and the general social contract we have is that we take turns,
Charlie Daniels, country boy will survive. I will survive.
Right.
I won't survive as nicely as I'm doing right now, but I'll find a way and survive.
Figure it out.
But I'll figure it out. But not everybody will be able to figure it out. Not because they don't want to, not because they won't work hard enough. It's just not going to be there.
They can't all figure it out.
Right.
You can either let the economy self-correct, or you can smooth those transitions using the government. Those are the choices that we know exist that can work, because we've seen both options. Great Depression, Great Recession. The recession was way less bad than the Depression.
And we've seen great growth.
Yes.
But it's been controlled by the government. The growth is being stimulated by the government, not by the economy.
And that's the Fed and the interest rate. And sorry, I know it can be complicated, but hopefully that resonated with all of you. It's because when the dominoes come down and the Chase banks of the world fall, it sucks for the rich people, but there are poor people who die. That's what happens, It stinks
for the wealthy,
right.
But it's life and death for the common man.
Yeah. It's bad for everybody. I mean, that's the point, right? The economy self-corrects. It's terrible for everyone. It's worse, though, for the people who were employed by the institutions that come down, or by the institutions that were built on the backs of others. That's why things like, for what it's worth, that's part of what makes me nervous with TrueChat. We're built on the stability. Part of the reason I advocated for a long time that we have our own network and our own app is because we are built, so many podcasts are built on the idea that Apple and Spotify and others will stay around. If they go belly up, well, now we can't, now we have to find a different way to get what we create to the people. Mm-hmm. And that's why Amazon is investing in its own delivery service. Not just because it wants to make more money, but because it doesn't like the idea of its fate being in the hands of the U.S. Postal Service and UPS and FedEx. That makes it nervous. It doesn't like that, especially when you get to the size Amazon is. Because it's, if UPS went out of business 5 years ago before Amazon had a lot more of this infrastructure in place, that could have been terrible. I mean, that could have been a major hit to Amazon's business, and it still would probably be detrimental today, but way less so. Because they're preparing for that. They're putting those systems in place to say, well, I don't want to just trust that it'll all correct and be fine on its own.
Right.
So think about it. Let us know your thoughts. We do want to know what they are. Maybe Lance and I are totally off. And if you think so, we'd welcome that input. And hey, if you agree with us, we definitely welcome that input. So let us know either way at TrueChat.org, Facebook, Twitter, and more. And all those companies that I was mentioning, you can find our podcasts on their many great platforms.
Spotify.
That's right, Spotify. And that's why we put our podcast in multiple places, so that no matter where you listen and regardless of what happens, you can keep access to the great show that is The State of Us. And we are very thankful for you tuning in to The State of Us. I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
We'll see you next time on The State of Us. Be the change.